So I was at the coin store when I saw this cool looking $50 with a couple guys on horseback. Now I had no idea what Stone Mountain was, only that was some guys on horseback and my family likes horseback riding. So I decided to look into it. And oh boy, did I step into a Civil War controversy of monumental proportions. I want to recognize that there's a lot of strong feelings around the Civil War, and so I want to present the story of the people involved and their perspectives without casting judgment on them. On the front here, you have Robert E. Lee, the famous general of the Confederate Army. Next to him is Stonewall Jackson. I'd never heard of Stonewall Jackson, or by his proper name, Thomas Jackson, so I decided to dig into him a bit. Thomas Jackson was born in what was then Virginia on January 21st, 1824, when a $50 looked like this. He was born to very respectable parents, but at the age of 3, Thomas's father passed away and left his mother with absolutely nothing. She was completely destitute with family that was trying to get their children from her. So she took her children and went to live in a little cottage very humbly. And when Thomas was 6, she remarried someone that was very poor, and I understand very stern too, if I remember right. And at last, she was forced to give up her children to the extended family, like she had been pressured all this time. So at the age of 7, Thomas was sent to live with various aunts and uncles, bouncing back and forth between families. When he was 8, he was sent back to his mom because she was on her deathbed. He watched her die, then went back to living with various family members. In fact, he was with one cousin, Judge John G. Jackson, who was a very stern person. And eventually, Thomas gave up on him one night. He went out to visit with some family member, have dinner, and he said, "Uncle and I don't agree. I have quit him." Now, this family member obviously is like, no, you have to live with him. And Thomas said again, "Uncle and I don't agree. I have quit him and shall not go back anymore." He then walked 18 miles to live with his cousin, Cummins Jackson, and his older brother that was out there at the time. Now, Cummins Jackson treated him with respect, and so he grew up the rest of his childhood with him. Other than that one time his brother convinced him to run off to go out west to seek their fortune. They wound up on the Mississippi River, living on a little island, cutting wood for the steamboats, ferries. It did not go over well. They came back, and so Thomas grew up with his cousin, where he was respected, and he gained respect in the community. He had so much respect that he was able to go to West Point Academy on recommendation, even though he was academically far behind his class. So at age 18, he reported to West Point. His classmates thought this poor mountain boy would be easy pickings, but they soon laid off on him after they came to respect his integrity, and he never backed down from a fight until he won, and he always won. So they left him alone. While he was at the academy, he started taking a book of maxims or sayings to guide him through life. His favorite maxim was, "You may be whatever you resolve to be." And he lived by this. He worked hard, he studied hard, he progressed through the academy until by the time he graduated at the age of 22, he graduated 27th in his class. When he graduated, the Mexican-American War had just broken out, and so he was assigned to be in the artillery, where he did well in the war. He worked up to major. After the war, he secured a teaching job at the Virginia Military Institute. Now, as a lecturer, frankly, he was terrible. They say that he would just memorize his lectures, show up to class, give them like a tape recording. Once a cadet asked him to clarify, he was confused. What needed to be clarified? He backed up his lecture, like backing up tape, repeated what he just said, and when the cadet asked again for clarification, he reprimanded him. However, despite his terrible lecturing, he was very respected. Both for his integrity, he saw everything as black and white. There was no room for a gray area. Either was right or was wrong. Not only that, but he was brilliant in the field of artillery. There was one story where it was a gray day, there was gray clouds coming in, storm coming in, and Major Jackson was out on the field directing an artillery exercise. The clouds kept getting grayer and grayer, everything kept getting darker and darker, and Jackson just kept moving on with his exercise, attacking after this imaginary enemy until the storm finally broke out. When it broke out, he finally dismissed his class, and they ran for cover. Major Jackson just stood in the field, in the rain, like a stone. At one point, somebody came out to him, offered him an umbrella to seek shelter. He declined. He stayed in the rain. Maybe he was thinking about the Mexican War, who knows. Shortly after he started teaching, he had a stronger desire to do good. So he joined a local Presbyterian church, and he became a deacon. Now at this time, Virginia was clamping down more and more on the blacks and on slavery, to the point that they actually pulled blacks out of black churches and forced them into white churches. Now, Major Jackson believed the rhetoric of the time that slavery was sanctioned by God in the Bible. And he actually would have preferred to free the slaves, but he was not one to go up against the Bible. So he organized a black Sunday school to teach what he thought was the poor and unfortunate blacks. And there would be 80 to 100 black students in his class at a time. He clearly loved them. They loved him. He actually taught them and encouraged literacy, which was very illegal according to Virginia at the time. The tension between the North and the South, the blacks, the slavery, was getting tighter and tighter, and conflict was becoming more and more obvious. Jackson did not want war. In fact, he went to his pastor and asked for a prayer to avoid war. Everything came to a head in November 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. A month later, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. Now at this time, Virginia had been waffling whether or not they would leave the Union or not. After Lincoln was inaugurated in March, he called for thousands of troops to go into the rebel states, and Virginia saw this as the final straw, a complete violation of the Constitution and the 10th Amendment. So Virginia succeeded. Jackson saw this as a states' rights issue, so he just went with Virginia and joined the Confederate Army. 3 months later, he found himself in the Battle of Manassas. Things were not going well for the Confederate Army, but Jackson stood stalwart. Jackson was standing his ground, refused to back down, so one of the other generals called out, "There is Jackson, standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer. Rally behind the Virginians." And with that rallying cry, the Confederates got together, and they won the Battle of Manassas, or as the North called it, the First Battle of the Bull Run. That is when Jackson was dubbed Stonewall Jackson, and his brigade was dubbed the Stonewall Brigade. It's the only brigade in the Confederate Army to receive their own name and not just a number. With this, Jackson grew up in the ranks until he truly became Robert E. Lee's right-hand man. Then, in 1863, Jackson was in the Battle of Chancellorsville. The battle had gone poorly. It was nighttime. The Confederate Army was basically hiding. Jackson decided to go out by himself to scout out where the Union Army was hiding, and he gave his troops strict orders to not let any Union troops in among their ranks. Then, early in the morning, when it was still hazy and there was still smoke from the battle the night before, the Confederate troops saw some men coming towards them. They thought this was Union troops and started firing on them. However, this is Stonewall Jackson returning. In the confusion, Stonewall Jackson was damaged and pulled off the battlefield. Not only that, but because the Confederate troops had started firing, this gave away their location. The Union started coming after them, and the battle started all over again. When General Lee found out how badly Jackson was wounded, he compared it to losing his right hand because he had relied on General Jackson so much. Shortly after that, the Civil War ended and Reconstruction began. Now let's fast forward to the year 1909. This was 44 years after the Civil War had ended. For comparison, the Civil War was closer to these people than World War II is to us. There were still several Confederate veterans damaged by the war. There were widows whose husbands had died from fighting in the war, and people whose fathers had died from fighting in the war. So the idea was birthed to create a monument to these soldiers to help them heal. So in 1915, the United Daughters of the Confederacy approached famed sculptor Gutzon Borglum about creating a memorial on Stone Mountain in Georgia. They wanted a 20-foot by 20-foot bust of General Robert Lee, but Guston compared this to putting a postage stamp on a barn door. He saw it was way too small. He wanted something bigger, grander. He had this huge idea. And so in 1916, he officially joined the project to create this memorial. The problem is a war has started in Europe. Right after he starts on this project, the United States enters World War I, and the project had to stop. After the war, things started back up again, and in 1923, actual work on Stone Mountain began. But the fundraising was lackluster. That's when the idea was launched to create a commemorative coin to raise funds for it, and that is where we get the Stone Mountain commemorative. But there was more problems. There was mounting tensions between Gutzon and the committee. In 1924, they unveiled the head of General Lee on the mountain. But the same year, tensions between Gutzon and the committee came to a head, and he basically rage quit. He destroyed all of his work, all of his drawings, and went to work on his most famous project, Mount Rushmore. Then on January 21st, 1925, the first 1,000 Stone Mountain commemorative coins were minted. Now, this was supposed to have a commemoration of President Harding. Instead, we have on the front General Lee and Stonewall Jackson, as well as several stars. On the reverse, we have the requisite eagle, as well as memorial to the valor of the soldiers of the South. Harding was nowhere on the coin. They invited President Calvin Coolidge to a presentation of this coin. Coolidge was like, no, I'm not touching that. No. So they were in trouble. Their main sculptor was gone, and they had a timeline. The memorial had to be done within so much time, or else the land would revert back to the original owner. So the committee hired Henry Augustus Lukeman to work on the project. He cleared away everything that Gutzon had done so that they would have fresh plots to work on. He scaled the project way back to something much more feasible. He started work on it, but 3 years later, the project was not done. The land had to revert back to the original owners, and it was 1928, the start of the Great Depression. So the project basically died from there. And so for a few decades, you had people on the Georgia freeway commuting back and forth in front of this failed project. Finally, in 1958, the state of Georgia decided to do something about this. They bought the mountain. They had to debate whether to clear it off the work again or to just finish it. They chose to finish it, possibly because it would have been cheaper to finish it than to clear it off again. And finally, in 1970, the Stone Mountain Memorial was completed. It is the largest relief carving in the world, featuring soldiers of the Confederate Army. Thanks for watching, everyone. Have a magical day.
I'll bid farewell to my wife